The crack of bone echoed through the kitchen louder than my scream. My arm bent at an unnatural angle, pain shooting like lightning through every nerve, and I collapsed onto the tile floor, gasping for air. The taste of blood rose in my throat. Tears blurred my vision, but above the pounding in my ears, I heard my mother's voice, calm and steady, speaking not to me, but to my brother Mark. He sat on the couch with his face buried in his hands, sobbing about losing his job. Mom stroked his hair, murmuring, "You'll get through this, sweetheart. We'll figure it out." I begged her, voice cracking. "Mom, please, I think my arm is broken." She glanced at me, eyes sharp as glass, then looked away. "Stop being dramatic, Sarah. Bones heal. Your brother just lost his future. He needs me more." The words landed harder than the fall itself. I clutched my arm bone grinding beneath my skin, every breath jagged, but what stole my breath completely was the sight of her turning her back to me and wrapping both arms around Mark, as though he were the only child in the room. He sniffled louder, muttering she always makes it about herself, and Mom nodded, agreeing as if my injury was nothing more than a nuisance. I lay there shaking the cold tiles, stealing the warmth from my body, realizing that the fracture was not just in my arm. It was in the bond that was supposed to protect me. In that moment, I was not her daughter. I was a shadow, a distraction, an inconvenience to be silenced so her golden boy could cry in peace. Rage burned hotter than pain, searing through the shock. I swore as I pressed my cheek to the floor, unseen and unwanted, that I would never forgive the night my broken arm mattered less than his broken pride. That was the night something inside me shifted forever, the night I stopped being the overlooked daughter and became the witness to her betrayal, carrying a wound deeper than bone and a fury that would never fade. I tried to sit up, but the pain shot down my arm with such ferocity that black spots swam in my vision and I collapsed back against the cold kitchen tiles. My breath came in shallow gasps, each one broken by the tremor of fear rising in my chest. I could not believe what had just happened. My mother, the woman who was supposed to rush to my side, who was supposed to check if my fingers still moved, or if blood was pooling under my skin, had chosen instead to sit with Mark. The sharp sound of his sobs filled the room as though he were the one bleeding, as though he were the one in pieces, and I realized my cries were being drowned by the performance of his despair. I whispered again, "Mom, please, it hurts so bad," and I stretched my good hand toward her, desperate for any scrap of attention, but she didn't even look in my direction. She was busy passing Mark another tissue, rubbing his shoulder, telling him that everything would be okay. My body shook with pain, my stomach lurched, and a raw scream tore out of me as I shifted and felt the jagged edges of bone grind together. Mark groaned in annoyance, turning his wet eyes toward me. "You always have to make a scene, Sarah. Even now, when I'm the one suffering, you try to steal the spotlight." My mother hushed him, but not in my defense. She said softly, "Don't waste your energy on her. She'll be fine. She always is." That sentence cut deeper than the fracture because it carried the weight of every year I had been overlooked. I lay there trembling, clutching my ruined arm while the two of them formed their little cocoon of shared grief on the couch. The television still hummed in the background, an ad for some holiday sale flashing across the screen, the ordinary world marching on while mine collapsed in shards. The smell of dinner still hung in the air, roasted chicken and garlic, but bile rose in my throat, and I wanted to vomit from the mix of pain and betrayal. I pressed my forehead to the tile, the chill numbing my skin, and thought this is what it feels like to be invisible, to be screaming in agony while the people you love act as if you are nothing more than a nuisance. My pulse hammered, my breathing quickened, and yet no one moved to help me. No one brought a phone, no one suggested an ambulance, no one checked if the bone had pierced through. The silence of neglect pressed heavier than the pain itself. I realized then that the fracture in my body was only a reflection of the deeper fracture that had always existed in my family, one that could no longer be ignored, one that had finally broken wide open with a sound that only I seemed to hear. The agony in my arm should have been enough to anchor me fully in the present, but as I lay there on the floor, ignored and dismissed, my mind traveled backward through the years, stitching together a long, painful pattern that explained exactly why I should not have been surprised. The truth was that this night was not the first time my pain had been minimized or my needs cast aside. It had been happening since I was old enough to walk and to talk. I thought about the birthdays first because they were the most obvious signs of the hierarchy in our house. When Mark turned 10, there was a party that lasted all afternoon with balloons that matched his favorite color streamers draped from every corner of the living room, a cake so large it took both of my parents to carry it to the table, and an entire neighborhood of children invited to celebrate him. I was 7 at the time, and I remember standing in the corner wearing the simple hand-me-down dress that had been mine for 2 years already, watching everyone laugh and sing around him. My mother's eyes sparkled with pride as she snapped photos, her voice rising above the crowd to sing happy birthday with exaggerated joy. 3 months later, when it was my turn, I came home from school to find a small store-bought cake on the kitchen counter with my name scrawled in blue icing that looked rushed and uneven. There were no balloons, no guests, just a quiet dinner and a reminder from Mom that times were tough and we couldn't do 2 big parties in the same year. But the truth was, they always found the money for Mark, even when Dad was still alive, and later, when it was just Mom. She always said Sarah is the independent one. Mark just needs more attention. That phrase became the lullaby of my childhood, whispered whenever I tried to ask for something more, repeated whenever I dared to point out the imbalance. The pattern repeated itself in school. I was naturally studious, my nose always buried in a book, and I worked hard to make sure my grades were flawless. When I brought home report cards with straight A's, my mother barely looked at them. Good, she said that's how it should be. There was no hug, no word of pride, no photo to show off. Meanwhile, when Mark managed to scrape by with C's after struggling through the semester, she rewarded him with dinner at his favorite restaurant. She posted about his perseverance on social media, writing about how proud she was of her resilient son. I remember staring at the glowing screen, reading her words over and over, wondering what I had to do to be worthy of the same praise. Apparently, perfection was only expected from me while mediocrity from him was celebrated as an achievement. As we grew older, the favoritism grew heavier and began to twist into financial chains that bound me tighter than I realized at the time. When Mark got his first car, a used sedan, that he drove recklessly, he crashed it within a month after drinking at a party. Instead of consequences, my mother called it a mistake, something to learn from, and she quietly paid for the repairs. When I finally got to borrow the family car for the first time, I forgot to fill the gas tank on the way back, and she exploded lecturing me for an hour about responsibility and respect. It was not just about cars, it was about every opportunity. Mark wanted to switch colleges after a year because he didn't like his major, and Mom supported him completely, paying for transfer fees, helping him move, even celebrating his decision to find his true path. I, on the other hand, worked 2 part-time jobs just to keep up with tuition and textbooks. When I told her my laptop was falling apart and I was struggling to complete assignments, she told me to check Craigslist or save up. That moment burned into me because the very next week, she bought Mark a brand new laptop, saying she couldn't bear to see him anxious about technology. I sat on my creaking machine, listening to the whir of the fan, knowing that my needs would never be seen as urgent enough. The older I got, the more insidious the neglect became, because it wasn't just about material things anymore. It was about identity, about the roles she assigned to us. Mark was the golden child, fragile and sensitive, the one who required constant attention, patience, and support. I was the strong one, the independent spirit, the girl who didn't need coddling. That label was supposed to sound like praise, but it was a prison. Every time she said, "You'll be fine," Sarah, I felt the bars closing around me. Fine meant invisible. Fine meant forgotten. Fine meant that my feelings didn't count. I thought back to the day of my high school graduation, a milestone I had worked toward for years. I had earned honors, I was valedictorian, and I had written a speech that I practiced 100 times. I looked out into the audience as I delivered it, hoping to see my mother's face, hoping for a smile, a proud tear. Her seat was empty. She had called earlier that day to tell me she couldn't make it because Mark had suffered a panic attack over a B- on his final exam. She said he really needs me right now. I walked across the stage to thunderous applause from strangers, but the one cheer I longed for never came. Later, she told me she hoped I understood, and I nodded because I had been conditioned to say yes, I understand. But inside, a little piece of me curled up and died. Even in adulthood, the pattern only intensified. I had a stable job, I paid my own bills, I kept myself afloat, and somehow that made me less visible. Mark, on the other hand, stumbled through internships, failed at jobs, moved cities twice, and each time she was there to catch him. Rent money appeared in his account. Care packages arrived at his door. Words of encouragement flowed like water. When I asked for small help once, just a ride after my shift ended late at night, she said I was capable and should figure it out myself. But when Mark called her in tears about being overwhelmed at work, she drove hours to sit with him. I told myself not to be bitter. I told myself that maybe he really did struggle more. Maybe she really did need to protect him. But lying on the floor that night with my arm shattered, I realized it had never been about balance. It had always been about choice, and she had always chosen him. I remembered the time Mark racked up nearly $10,000 in credit card debt. He had been careless spending on gadgets and trips he couldn't afford. Mom bailed him out immediately, then turned to me and asked if I could cover utilities for the next few months to help her rebalance the household budget. I was 21, barely making ends meet, but I did it because I thought that was what love meant. Love meant sacrifice. Love meant picking up the slack. Love meant swallowing the bitterness and telling myself it would all be worth it one day when she finally saw me. But she never did. There were bruises, too, not just emotional ones. Once Mark shoved me during an argument, and I fell against the coffee table, leaving a deep purple mark along my hip. I showed Mom, hoping she would finally say enough, but she sighed and told me not to provoke him when he was already stressed. Another time, he raised his voice so loud the neighbors knocked on the door, and instead of reprimanding him, she told me to lower my tone so he wouldn't feel attacked. I learned then that even my safety was negotiable, that his comfort was more important than my bruises. The memories cascaded one after another, each one fitting into place like shards of glass, forming a shattered mirror. From the outside, we looked like an ordinary family, a mother and her 2 children holding on after a father's absence. But inside, the truth was brutal. My role had been scripted long ago. Mark, the delicate son, the one to be coddled, the one whose failures were softened with excuses and gifts. Sarah, the strong daughter, the one to be overlooked, the one whose achievements were expected and whose pain was dismissed. I had lived my entire life inside that lie, telling myself that if I just worked harder, if I stayed quiet, if I kept giving, one day she would turn and finally see me. But as I lay there bleeding and ignored, I understood with bone-deep certainty that she never would. The irony was cruel. I had spent years convincing myself that neglect was a kind of twisted love, that maybe she trusted me more because she believed I could handle everything on my own. But now, with my arms screaming and my pleas silenced, I saw the truth as clearly as the sterile light above an emergency room bed. This was not love. This was expectation dressed up as affection. This was control disguised as trust. This was a hierarchy where my worth was measured only by how little I demanded. And lying there broken in both body and spirit, I knew that the fracture I carried was not new at all. It had been forming all along, splintering slowly beneath the weight of years, and now it had finally snapped. The throbbing in my arm blurred into the background as the sharper ache of recognition carved itself through my chest, a realization blooming that I had spent nearly 3 decades trying to deny. All those nights I had repeated to myself that my mother loved me in her own way, that her dismissal was just tough love, that her focus on Mark was because he was fragile, dissolved in the harsh clarity of this moment. The truth was simpler and crueler. She had never seen me at all. She had seen my utility, my resilience, my ability to survive without her. She had seen me as the child who could absorb neglect without crumbling, and so she had chosen to keep pouring every ounce of tenderness into the son who broke at every disappointment. That was not love. It was a transaction where I gave endlessly and received nothing in return. The ceiling above me felt suddenly like the ceiling of every sterile hospital I had ever imagined, blank white, humming with fluorescent indifference, and in it I saw the reflection of my entire life. Every time she said, "You will be fine," Sarah, she was not comforting me. She was excusing herself. Every time she called me independent, she was really saying, "You do not matter enough to tend to." The pattern was undeniable, written across birthdays, forgotten graduations, unattended bruises, ignored bills, shifted onto my shoulders while Mark was coddled for every stumble. My breath hitched as the memory of my valedictorian speech rose up me searching the crowd for her face and finding only an empty chair, while later she told me he needed her more. That phrase had been her mantra, her justification, her shield. He needs me more. And tonight it had reached its final grotesque form. My bone was cracked and jutting under my skin, my voice hoarse from begging. And still, she looked at me as though I were an inconvenience, as though my injury was less urgent than his unemployment. Rage and grief twisted together inside me, the two strands of rope that had always bound me to this family. But for the first time, they stopped pulling me back in. For the first time, they coiled into something else, something sharper. I whispered to myself so faintly it almost vanished in the air. I will not do this anymore. I will not keep waiting for her to see me. The words startled me because they sounded final, like a vow sealed in blood and pain. I pressed my cheek against the cold tile, and in the silence between Mark's sobs and my mother's soothing, I realized that if I did not rewrite the story right now, no one ever would. This was the breaking point, not just of my arm, but of the role I had been forced to play. I was done being the strong daughter who needed nothing. I was done being invisible until I was useful. I was done bleeding quietly so that someone else could shine. My heart pounded with a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration, because this clarity felt like stepping off a cliff and also like taking my first real breath. Tears streamed down my face, but they were no longer just from the pain in my body. They were from the grief of letting go of the illusion I had clung to all these years, the illusion that one day she would wake up and love me the way she loved him. She would not. She never would. The weight of that truth pressed down on me and then, to my surprise, lifted something off me at the same time. I could feel the seed of something colder, harder, steadier taking root beneath my ribs, a resolve that felt as unbreakable as the bone that had just shattered. This was not the end of me. This was the end of the prison she had built with her neglect. And as I lay there trembling, I knew that the Sarah who rose from this would not be the same girl who had spent years begging for scraps of attention. She would be someone who finally saw herself, even if her mother never did. The morning after the accident, I forced myself out of bed with my arms strapped tight in a temporary cast, and every movement a reminder of how close I had come to losing more than just bone. I stared at the mirror and saw a woman hollowed out by years of invisibility, but I also saw eyes that no longer looked away from the truth. My mother had not checked on me once that night after she sent me to urgent care with a dismissive wave. She had not asked if I could manage bills while missing work, and she had not asked how the pain was. Her silence was not oversight. It was the clearest message she had ever given me. You are on your own. For once, I decided to take her words literally, not as a curse, but as a liberation. I sat at the small kitchen table of my apartment and opened my laptop, scrolling through old folders where I had quietly stored proof over the years without even realizing why. There were screenshots of bank transfers where I had covered Mark's overdue rent receipts for car repairs I had paid when he crashed again, and messages from my mother pressing me to help out just until he gets on his feet. I had dozens of them, each one carrying the same pattern, each one a tiny brick in the wall of responsibility they had built around me. At the time, I thought I was just being the dependable one, but now I saw them for what they were: evidence of financial and emotional abuse. My hands shook as I dragged the files into a new folder labeled simply Proof. For years, I had gaslit myself into thinking I imagined the imbalance, but here it was in black and white. I knew I could not face them alone anymore. I scrolled through my contacts and found the name Rebecca Hayes, the lawyer I had once worked with over a lease dispute. She was professional calm, and most importantly, she had looked at me back then as if I mattered. I dialed her number before I could lose my nerve. Rebecca answered on the second ring, and when I told her my name, she remembered me instantly. Her first question was not about money or time. It was, "Are you safe?" The words broke me open because no one in my family had ever asked me that. I explained through ragged breaths the accident, my mother's dismissal, the years of supporting Mark, the proof I had gathered. She listened without interrupting, and when I finally ran out of words, she said clearly, Sarah, what you are describing is not just neglect, it is exploitation. You have every right to cut ties legally and financially. My heart pounded because hearing it from someone else made it real. I asked her what I could do, and she told me we would revoke the power of attorney I had once given my mother, just in case we would remove both her and Mark as beneficiaries from my accounts, and we would set up protections so they could no longer access anything of mine. I felt both terrified and electrified. This was not a small step, it was a declaration. Rebecca said she would meet me the next morning with papers to sign, and until then I should rest. Rest sounded impossible, but as I ended the call, I felt steadier. For the first time, I was not just surviving their neglect. I was preparing to fight back. The day of Mark's birthday arrived the kind of occasion my mother treated like a national holiday. The house was filled with decorations and the sound of laughter from family friends who had been invited to celebrate his 33rd year as though it were a triumph instead of another chapter in a life cushioned by excuses. I walked in with my arms still stiff in a brace, my steps deliberate, my breath steady, though my chest quaked with anticipation. At my side was Rebecca Hayes, carrying a briefcase that held not just documents, but the embodiment of every sleepless night I had spent believing I was powerless. The room fell quiet for a moment when people noticed me, the forgotten daughter entering the Golden Boy celebration, and then the chatter resumed. Some eyes flicking to my brace, and then away as though to acknowledge my injury was impolite. Mark beamed in the center of attention, soaking up congratulations, despite the fact that he was unemployed, his failures hidden beneath layers of balloons and cake frosting. My mother spotted me, and her smile faltered for just a second before she plastered it back on and said, "Oh, Sarah, you made it. How nice of you to come." Her tone made it sound like I was a guest, not her child. I took a breath and stepped closer to the living room where everyone was gathered. Rebecca remained at my side, calm professional, her presence a shield. I said I didn't come here to celebrate. I came here to finally be heard. A ripple went through the room, whispers rising. Mark scoffed, rolling his eyes, muttering, "Here we go again." My mother's voice sharpened as she said, "Sarah, don't start tonight. This is Mark's day." I held up my good hand and said, "No, Mom, this is the day I stop being silent." The words shook the air, and for the first time in my life, I felt the power of my own voice filling a room that had always drowned me out. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small recorder, pressing play. The sound of my mother's voice filled the room, cold and dismissive. "Stop being dramatic. Sarah Bones, heal your brother just lost his future. He needs me more." Gasps erupted among the guests. My aunt covered her mouth. My cousin's eyes widened. Mark sputtered, "That's taken out of context," but Rebecca calmly said no. It is exactly what she said. Then I unfolded papers, laying them on the table, bank statements, transfers, messages, each one a receipt of my silence. I spoke louder now, my voice steady. "For years, I paid your rent. Mark, I covered your debts. I bought your groceries while I worked 2 jobs to stay afloat. I did it because Mom told me I was strong, because she said you needed her more, and every time I bled, she looked away." My mother's face flushed, her hands trembling as she said, "Sarah, you're embarrassing yourself. We don't discuss private family matters in front of others." But I locked eyes with her and said, "You made it public when you ignored me, when you told everyone Mark was fragile and I was fine. Fine has been my prison. Tonight, I'm breaking out." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice clear as she announced that as of that morning, all legal and financial ties between me, my mother, and my brother had been severed. Power of attorney revoked, beneficiary rights, removed access to my accounts, terminated. My mother gasped, "You can't do this, we're family!" And I said no, we are blood, and that is not the same thing. Mark lunged forward, his face twisted with fury. "You're jealous," he spat. "You've always been jealous of me." I laughed then, not with humor but with clarity. Jealous of what Mark of failure rewarded, of mistakes celebrated, of debts erased while my hard work was ignored. You are not someone to envy. You are the reminder of everything I refuse to be. The room was silent except for the hum of the ceiling fan. Rebecca handed my mother a copy of the documents, her professionalism like a blade slicing through the air. My mother's lips quivered, tears threatening but not falling as she whispered after everything I did for you. I raised you. I gave you life. I held her gaze and answered. You raised me to be invisible so you could hold him up. You gave me life, but you never gave me love. And that is the difference I will never forgive. The final blow came not from my anger, but from my calm. I said to both of them, "Tonight is the last night you feed off me. Tonight is the last night you drain me. From now on, I am no longer the strong daughter who exists to carry your weight. From now on, I am only myself, and I choose to be free." Rebecca closed her briefcase with a decisive snap, and for the first time in my memory, my mother and Mark were the ones speechless, stripped of the narrative they had always controlled. The silence that filled the room was not the silence of neglect. It was the silence of justice, heavy and undeniable. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of the guests, their faces a mixture of shock and recognition. Some avoided my eyes, unwilling to confront what they had witnessed, but others looked at me with something like respect. My cousin Jules gave the smallest nod, and in that gesture, I felt a confirmation that I had not imagined the imbalance all these years, that others had seen it too, but had remained silent. Now the silence was broken. I walked out with Rebecca at my side, my arm aching, my body trembling, but inside me a new steadiness took root. I had confronted them not in whispers, not behind closed doors, but in the open in front of the people they had always tried to impress. I had turned their stage into my own, and in doing so, I had finally claimed my voice. The fallout began before I had even reached home. My phone buzzed in my pocket as Rebecca drove me back to my apartment, her calm presence a buffer against the storm I knew was coming. The first message was from Mark, the words jagged with rage. "You'll regret this. You just humiliated us in front of everyone." Then another followed almost immediately. "You've always been jealous of me. Admit it. You hate that Mom loves me more." I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening, but I remembered Rebecca's advice. Silence is power. I put the phone face down and refused to answer. Moments later, a notification from Facebook popped up. My mother had posted a vague but poisonous message. Sometimes the ones you love most cut you the deepest, especially when they forget who raised them. Within minutes, the comments began pouring in. Relatives I hadn't seen in years chimed in with sympathy for her, typing things like, "Stay strong, she'll realize her mistake," and "Loyalty is everything in a family." The narrative was shifting just as Rebecca had warned. They were painting themselves as the wounded ones, the betrayed ones, while I was cast as the cruel daughter who turned on her family. It was a performance they had perfected for decades, and now they were staging it on a public stage. My phone buzzed again and again. Aunts and uncles left passive-aggressive remarks. People I barely knew from church offered prayers for my poor mother and her difficult child. I felt the old shame creeping in, the same shame that had silenced me 1,000 times before, but I forced myself to breathe through it. Rebecca reminded me that when abusers lose control of their narrative, they lash out with smear campaigns, twisting truth into lies. Their words were knives, but they were also confessions. They had no defense for what I had revealed, so they spun a story where I was selfish and ungrateful. I turned off the phone at last, letting the notifications pile up in the dark. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and my own breathing. For once, the silence felt like strength. I reminded myself that the truth was already out. I had spoken it in front of witnesses. I had placed the documents in their hands, and nothing they posted online could erase the sound of my mother's voice on that recording or the sight of me finally standing tall. Their campaign would rage on, but for the first time I felt no urge to defend myself. Their noise no longer defined me. The days that followed were strangely quiet once I muted their numbers and blocked their profiles. At first, the silence felt heavy, a reminder of the void that opened when blood relatives decided I was no longer convenient to them. But slowly, that silence became something else, something close to peace. I hobbled around my apartment with one arm cradled in a sling, relearning the simplest tasks like pouring coffee or buttoning a shirt. But this time I was not truly alone. My coworker Emily stopped by after her shift with bags of groceries and an awkward smile, saying she figured I might not want to go shopping right away. She never asked for details, she just set the bags down and gave me a quick hug. My neighbor Mrs. Lively knocked once a week with flowers from her garden, handing them to me with a nod, as though to remind me that kindness could be simple and steady. One evening, my cousin Jules sent a private message, a quiet confession that she had always seen the way my mother favored Mark, that she had always thought I was treated unfairly. Reading her words made me cry harder than anything my mother had ever said, because finally someone had acknowledged the truth without me begging for it. I realized then that family was not defined by shared blood, but by shared presence by the people who show up when the lights go out. Therapy became another anchor. My new therapist listened as I unraveled years of memories, each one a thread knotted with guilt and longing. I admitted that for years I had believed love was earned through sacrifice that I had given and given because I thought one day they would say thank you. She looked at me calmly and said, "Sarah, you were not loved for who you were rewarded for what you gave." That hit me with the force of truth. It explained the hollow ache that had followed me since childhood, the ache of being useful but never cherished. Week by week, I began to release the belief that I had to bleed to be worthy. I opened a new bank account under my name alone. I set up a savings plan for my future, and for the first time, I felt the security of knowing that every dollar was mine to decide. Small acts became revolutions. Cooking dinner just for myself without guilt, taking walks with no one to report back to, laughing at a silly movie because the sound belonged to me alone. Each gesture stitched me back together in a way no apology from them ever could. The ache in my arm dulled with time, but what healed slower was the wound carved by neglect. And yet, with every flower left at my door, every message of solidarity, every session where my voice did not shake, I rebuilt myself. They had tried to convince me that silence was survival, but I had found a louder truth. Survival was choosing myself. Survival was drawing a line and refusing to step back over it. In that clarity, I finally began to heal. Months later, as the cast was removed and the brace gave way to only a faint ache when it rained, I stood by my apartment window watching the city move steadily beneath me, and I realized that the real healing had never been about bone. It had been about rewriting the script I was given at birth, the script that demanded I be silent, strong, and invisible so that others could shine. My mother and Mark never apologized, never admitted fault, but their absence had become its own strange gift. The quiet they left behind was no longer suffocating. It was spacious, a place where I could breathe and finally hear my own voice. I began to fill that space with people who chose me without condition. Friends who showed up with groceries, a cousin who admitted the truth, a neighbor who knocked with flowers. Each gesture reminded me that family is not who shares your last name, but who shows up when you are bleeding. To anyone listening who has lived in the shadow of a golden child who has been told you are fine, so often that you started to believe your pain did not matter, hear me clearly. You do not have to keep proving your worth by enduring neglect. You do not have to bleed quietly so others can be comfortable. Love is not a transaction measured by how much you give and how little you need. Love does not demand that you disappear so someone else can feel important. If you are waiting for a parent to finally see you, waiting for a sibling to finally thank you, waiting for validation that never arrives, understand this. You may never get it from them, but that does not mean you are unworthy. The night my mother ignored my broken arm taught me the harshest lesson of my life, but it also gave me the freedom to choose myself. I will never forgive her for that betrayal, but I will always thank myself for finally refusing to stay silent. If my story reaches you in your own moment of doubt, let it be the push you need to draw your own line. You are already enough, not because of what you give, but because of who you are. And the day you stop begging for love from those who weaponize your strength is the day you finally begin to heal.